On the mouse there, you can just move it on the mouse.
Look at that.
Is that all right?
That's brilliant.
Or I can give you
Great.
a
No, that's perfect. That's perfect.
Is that all right?
Yeah, perfect. I haven't seen that before now.
You don't need it.
No, no, no.
Traveling might get happen.
Oh, yeah, that's grand. Hopefully, yeah.
Just
Try this one. We'll see. I'm used to just shouting at my students before they're younger than me.
Lots of laser pointer on the B as well.
I've never seen this before.
It's a high
Zoom thing.
PowerPoint? It's down in the corner. You can do highlighter.
I don't know this. Of course.
That's what you play with.
Yeah. I'll return my lectures together at last minute. Of course,
So tough either.
manage that. I did record it actually. Right, good evening, everybody, and welcome as always to Queen's for our UAS lecture. Just before I introduce our speaker this evening, the usual housekeeping rules, please, could you make sure that your mobile phones are switched off or on silent? Likewise, anybody who's listening and online, please. In case there should be any emergency or fire or anything, not expecting it, of course, but just in case, just please note where the fire exits are, two at the top of the lecture theatre and the two at the bottom here, and just follow any of the committee members. Ready. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Joanna Brück. Joanna is an archaeologist and academic who specialises in Bronze Age Britain and Ireland. Studied for her BA and PhD at the University of Cambridge, where she was a junior research fellow from 97 to 99 before returning to University College Dublin as a lecturer, becoming senior lecturer in 2006. In 2013, she was appointed as reader in archaeology at Bristol University and was promoted to professor before returning to UCD in 2020 as Professor of Archaeology and head of the School of Archaeology. Research themes have included all aspects of life and death in the Bronze Age, and her more recent work has included 19th and 20th century Ireland. She's widely published and involved in the Prehistoric Society, Royal Irish Academy, and lots more. Co-founder of the Bronze Age Forum, so there really is no better person to speak to us about the Bronze Age. So I'll hand over now to Joanna. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. It's really lovely to come up to Belfast. Always a great excuse, great to have an excuse to come up to Belfast. So firstly, hopefully everybody can hear me. I have to say, I don't always get on with these. Sometimes I just shout at my students, and they mostly seem to cope. I'm going to talk about animals in Bronze Age Europe today, primarily focusing on Britain and the Netherlands, because those are two of the study areas of a project that I'm involved in at the moment. And I suppose really to kind of set the scene, I want to, let me see if I can make this work. Should just be left and right arrows, presumably. Maybe I'll try this one. Okay, lovely, thank you. So just to set the broader context, Bronze Age Europe is often viewed as the first globalized economy, a period of technological innovation, long distance trade, and agricultural intensification, all of which are thought to have facilitated the creation of wealth and increasing interpersonal competition and the emergence of institutional forms of social difference. So in this sense, the Bronze Age is often seen as a kind of a stepping stone to the modern world. And central to the developments of the period, you often have in narratives of the Bronze Age, the activities of warriors, traders, chiefs, metalworkers. But what I would argue is that this is quite a colonial narrative in many ways, in the sense that objects, artifacts, animals, land, and so on are seen as objects of economic exploitation and control. So there's I suppose, a particular vision of the Bronze Age as a period in which competitive individualism, violence, and warfare are kind of naturalized in a fairly evolutionist narrative. So you've got this idea of the Bronze Age as the precursor, if you like, to the modern age in terms of its hierarchization, its centralization, its the importance of trade and exchange, metalworking, industrialization, economic, agricultural intensification, and so on. So I suppose in some ways, what I'm trying to understand is whether that vision of the Bronze Age is actually a bit anachronistic, whether maybe we're unconsciously kind of imposing aspects of the modern Western world onto the past through these ideas of economic intensification and so on and so forth. And I suppose what I'm trying to do is think about ask whether looking at Bronze Age animals in a way that I'll explain in a minute might actually allow us to decolonize the Bronze Age, to think critically about those kinds of models of the period. Now, before I go into that, it is worth noting that, in fact, there's considerable differences in the way in which animals have been discussed and explored in prehistory, in European prehistory. So, for instance, there's been a lot of very interesting work in recent years on animals in the Mesolithic. So, in the Mesolithic, archaeologists are very used to the idea of animals having active agency, being important members of society in some way, the idea that animals might have had personhood of some sort, and how, I suppose, animal behavior and the materiality of animal bodies and animal lives influenced the lives of the people who encountered them. So people working on the Mesolithic, archaeologists working on the Mesolithic, are much more attuned to the idea that animals might have been more than just objects of economic exploitation. And the same with a lot of archaeologists working on the Neolithic. There's been a much more interest, explicit interest and explicit focus on the role, the various different roles that animals might have held in the Neolithic. I suppose probably because of the complexities of domestication as a process, meaning that human-animal relations in the Neolithic have obviously become a bit of a subject of discussion and debate. But in contrast to those earlier periods of prehistory, studies of the European Bronze Age have tended to take animals kind of for granted. Bronze Age scholars tend to think of animals primarily as food, thinking about their relative contribution to the Bronze Age diet. Secondary products like milk and wool might be thought of as markers of technological innovation and a means of generating economic wealth for people. And then on the other hand, so they're seen as kind of economic resources on the one hand, but they're also seen as symbolic resources for human manipulation and use. So for instance, there's a lot of religious iconography, Bronze Age religious iconography involving horse as a kind of a symbol of the divine in some way. So horses are often seen as kind of symbols that mark personal status of warrior chiefs because perhaps they had preferential access to them as animals. So I suppose that we're not really used to thinking about animals as kind of active agents, active members of human society. We think of them as just a means to an end for people. They're either good to eat, they're either a form of wealth, or maybe they're some kind of a symbol of chiefly power, for example. So I suppose I'm trying to move beyond that to think about animals more broadly, animals as active co-participants in Bronze Age society, as co-creators of the Bronze Age world. And hopefully this might allow me to think a little bit more critically about the kinds of models of the Bronze Age that we tend to accept, the kinds of models that I mentioned at the start of the lecture that are often a little bit anachronistic in terms of us tending to impose kind of quite capitalistic and quite modernist understandings of the world onto the distant past. So I suppose that I want to think a little bit more about what it meant to live with animals, to pay attention to the embodied entanglement of human and animal lives. Of course, the primary domesticates, we know that they were central to the Bronze Age economy, but we haven't really thought about the implications of that in terms of intimacy, affect, and care between humans and animals. And anybody, from a farming background in this room will be very familiar with those kinds of ideas. But those of us archaeologists grown up in an urban context, we just don't think about it enough. So, of course, for the majority of Bronze Age people, their lives would have been lived in close proximity with animals. The rhythms of everyday labor would have been shaped by animal needs. That might have been, taking animals to pasture or water, keeping them away from crops, collecting fodder, milking, repairing fences and shelters to keep them in place, looking after newborn lambs or kids, and bring animals home at nightfall. So the kind of rhythms of everyday life in farming societies and in the Bronze Age, of course, would have been very much shaped by animals' needs and behavior, and people would have been very attuned to that. And I suppose my random selection of images on the PowerPoint there, really to make the point that farming communities, I suppose, these kinds of daily proximities and interactions result very often in intimate attachments between people and their animals, a deeply felt sense of connection and mutual acknowledgement that requires an ability to understand, communicate, and collaborate with those other animals. So people living with animals often, though not always, identify them as or recognize them as subjects with particular character and histories, whose capacity for intention and emotion draw them into relations of care and interdependence. And of course, this intertwining of human and animal lives is underscored by shared histories of inhabitation, attachment to landscape, as well as by histories of mobility and exchange, in which people and animals and marriage partners, the dead, and so on, they're all making perilous journeys to maintain relatedness. If you think about the importance of animals in exchange relationships, for example, in marriage transactions or in funerary feasting and so on. So that's a little bit about the kind of theoretical perspective I'm coming from. But what I want to do is talk to you a little bit more about some of the things we've been exploring in the project that I have ongoing at the moment. So we're just 2 years into a 5-year project, and we're trying to bring together lots of different types of data, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slide. So lots of different types of information that might help us to understand animal lives and how people and animals interacted in the Bronze Age. And I'm doing this with colleagues because I'm not an archaeological scientist, but of course there's fantastic potential now for archaeological sciences like isotope chemistry or ancient DNA to really illuminate aspects of animal lives in the past. So I'm doing this with various collaborators in Bristol and Paris, and then in Trinity College in Dublin, the geneticists there. And we're looking at 3 different regions: southern England, part of the northern Netherlands, and southwest or southeast Poland. And the reason we're focusing in on those regions is partly because, as you'll see a little bit later on, there's amazing kind of what I would call animal architectures preserved in the archaeological record. So things like droveways, waterholes, even hoofprints. So we can actually look at where the animals are in the landscape. And of course, also these regions have produced nicely preserved animal bones. So you'll know that, for instance, in lots of parts of Ireland, unfortunately, the acidic soils mean that animal remains themselves are not always very, very well preserved. So we've been trying to find assemblages which have great preservation so we can do interesting scientific analyses. The other interesting things about these regions is that for example, in southern England versus the Netherlands, you have different forms of domestic architecture. So in the Netherlands, in the Bronze Age, you have longhouses, some of which have evidence for internal stalling of animals, so internal housing of animals. So animals in the Netherlands appear to have actually been part of the household. Whereas in Britain, it's a little bit less clear, although I'll show you an example later on where that does seem to have been the case. Then in southern Poland, there are more nucleated settlements than there would be in Northwest Europe. So generally speaking, in Northwest Europe, most people seem to have lived in scattered farmsteads, whereas in parts of South Central Europe, it was often the case that people lived in small villages. So we're kind of interested in comparing, contrasting everyday interaction in a community where people are living in a small village. You know, how do they interact with animals? How does that different form of organization of settlement impact how they are living with animals, as opposed to in the more dispersed farmsteads that are a bit more characteristic of Northwest Europe? So here are some of the things that we're looking at. So lots of different stuff, really. So we're looking at things like animal management. So considering things like diet. So what are animals being fed? Is there evidence for a supplementary feeding of animals, for instance, with leafy fodder? We can think of, again, it's just amazing archaeological science techniques that it's feasible to look at, to use nowadays. We can consider things like weaning. So were cattle weaned young, or were they weaned later? And that might tell us something about the intensity of milk production, for example, in Bronze Age societies. Or things like birthing seasonality. So is there a shift to year-round birthing amongst cattle? Because, of course, wild cattle are seasonal breeders. So we can look at these kinds of things. We can look at animal mobility, again, using isotopes, to consider things like daily, seasonal life course mobility to, I suppose, consider how people and animals relationships would have been potentially bound up together at all these different kind of scales of analysis, from day to day, bringing your cattle in at the beginning of, at the end of the day, or the end of the, the summer season, if you're bringing them in the winter or whatever, to the relationship, kind of biographical relationship between people and animals. If animals, for example, were part of marriage transactions, for instance. And then thinking about things like breeding with ancient DNA, there's a lot of potential here for thinking about not only different ancestries, so different, not breeds in the modern sense, but different types of animals. We can also think about whether there's selection for specific morphological or behavioral traits. So are we seeing the emergence of woolly sheep at this time? Are we seeing selection for coat color amongst cattle? So really interesting things that we can start to think about there. We can also think about disease and relatedness. Can we see herds of cattle, between particular groups of sites, for instance? So there's lots of really fun things we can think about with the science. And then I suppose with more traditional archaeological approaches, we can think about things like animal iconography, because there is some iconography, some artistic representations of animals in the European Bronze Age. We can think about depositional practices. So do we find animal burials in the same way that we find human burials in some regions? And it does seem to be the case that sometimes that occurs. Or can we look at patterns of butchery, consumption, use of different parts of the animal's body? If you think about, for example, today, how a choice of cut of meat, for instance, it can be related to, or even choice of what animal is deemed to be edible or not, that can relate to your religious beliefs, your ethnicity, your class, and so on. So those kinds of aspects of selectivity could be really interesting as well. So I'm going to start with just a few examples to give you a sense of the kinds of things we're interested in. And I'm starting with my own comfort zone, because I've probably spent too many decades working on depositional practice and domestic architecture in southern Britain. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the work that my team has been doing in the Netherlands and also southern Britain. So this, I think, is a really interesting site to start with. So this is a site in Kent, in southeast England. And here you have, hopefully you can see, a young woman with her head lying on the head of a cow. And I suppose I'm kind of interested to consider, at least, whether this bodily proximity in death is reflective of some kind of intimate interaction in life. Now, this cow was around 12 or 13 years old, so quite old on death. And traditional zooarchaeological approaches would probably tell us that this cow was kept for her milk. And we know from research, chemical lipid analysis of Bronze Age ceramics, that there were high levels of milk consumption, but we haven't really thought about the implications of that for human-animal sociality, or in the embodied interaction that this indicates. So this young woman was around 17 or 18 years old. So it's possible that she milked this animal, this particular animal, for much of her life. We know from ethnohistoric and ethnographic studies that cows will often let down their milk for particular people only. And again, there's lots of lovely ethnohistoric documentation describing how milkers back in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, for example, sang to their cows as they worked. And cows wouldn't let down their milk unless they heard their favorite song. There's some lovely accounts of Scottish milkmaids in the late 19th century that describe these kinds of things. And of course, through these kinds of daily proximities, people and animals come to be attuned to each other's moods and dispositions so that rich and emotionally satisfying bonds can develop. We can also think, in this kind of context, maybe this cow traveled with this young woman as part of her bride wealth, if that was the system at the time. So that in that case, the life of human and animal would have been inextricably interconnected. And it's also useful, I think, to consider the framework of everyday practice. So things like milking cattle or seasonal patterns of mobility, such as transhumance between, upland pastures in the summer, for example, those patterns are often strongly gendered, or they may be linked to particular age groups. Teenagers might be sent off. We know this again from the west of Ireland in the 19th century. Young women and children, teenagers, were sent off to up into the uplands with the cattle in the summer to pasture the cattle, so that what you did with your animals was very much part and parcel of your social identity, your gendered identity, your age identity, and so on. The other thing we can think about with this particular example is the agency of the animal herself, because at her age, this cow might well have been the kind of matriarch who assumed the role of herd leader, because cattle are social animals who transmit knowledge intergenerationally. Maybe that was why part of her body, and of course a significant part, the skull, was chosen for deposition in this feature. Now, maybe that's a bit of a overly romanticized vision of human-animal relations in the Bronze Age. Maybe that's just me, I don't know. So it's important not to, I suppose, overemphasize that kind of romanticized vision of the Bronze Age, because of course we know that obviously people did kill and eat animals in the Bronze Age. So here we've got sheep in this case, so 4 sheep in pits, 4 pits, a row of 4 pits, bisecting the entrance to this ditched settlement enclosure. So this is the ditch surrounding a Bronze Age settlement. Again, a sort of a small farmstead, so there's a little circular roundhouse. The animals in this case, and you can see one of them here, they were relatively young. So unlike the cow, the older cow, the more mature animal in the previous slide, these animals didn't die of natural causes. So 2 of them were between 1 and 2 years old, and the other 2 were between 3 and 4 years old. And one of them may have been decapitated. So there you're thinking maybe this is more something around sacrifice, which raises, of course, a different kind of set of questions around human-animal relations. I suppose that at some level, sacrifice and consumption are both acts of violence. They remind us of the disparities of power between people and animals, because of course, the animals didn't have any choice in the matter. But I think it's important nonetheless to maybe unpack those relations of power, because they didn't necessarily take the same form as, I suppose, human-animal relations in the present. Because of course, if we think about modern factory farming, that at some level really denies the kind of personhood of the animals in order to legitimate their slaughter on an industrial scale. But we know again from ethnographic accounts in particular, that in other societies, the ethics of killing, eating and sacrificing animals are considered in very different ways, so that the gift of the animal may be acknowledged by respectful treatment of their bodily remains. So this idea that the animal is giving itself up for you in order that you may continue to live, and you have to therefore treat it with respect. And very often that carries through to respectful treatment of its remains after death. And certainly there is, I would argue, a lot of evidence in the Bronze Age for quite a mutualistic relationship with the natural world. This is a little random slide from Dartmoor, but this pot is one of my favorite archaeological finds. It was found, little Bronze Age pot, found tucked into a cleft in the rock, high up the rock face at the Durastone on Dartmoor, which is a big rock face. It was found by a climber climbing up the rock. And to me, I would kind of read that as an offering to spirits or ancestors embedded in place. So I'm kind of thinking here, there's a mutualistic rather than an extractive or exploitative relationship with the natural world, to my eye, in the Bronze Age. So maybe we should think about this when it comes to thinking about animals and what people did with animals. So I suppose, you know, that's not, on the other hand, to negate the kinds of disparities of power between people and animals that are, of course, important to think about, but maybe we can just think about them a little bit more carefully, because, of course, living with animals requires choreography, collaborative acts of understanding and attunement in which people need to respond to, be cognizant of animal needs and desires. And also, I suppose, people probably recognized individual animals as more or less mischievous, patient, clever, bad-tempered, in the same way that we do with our own, you know, animal familiars in our homes today, cats and dogs, you know, with whom a certain level of negotiation is required in order to live well together. So I guess what I'm saying is the power relations between people and animals were not fixed or unidirectional, but require unpacking and thinking about. And I mentioned earlier, of course, that in the Netherlands, we have these longhouses with animal stalls in them. And I suppose, you know, if you're actually living with animals, then that kind of choreography, if you like, that taking account of one another's needs and behaviors and space and so on is going to be very, very important. There's less evidence or less archaeologically accessible evidence for humans and animals sharing living space in Britain, but it does occur. So on the left there is the site of Must Farm in Cambridgeshire, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a kind of a Bronze Age Pompeii in the East Anglian Fens, where basically a 9th century settlement was burnt down in a catastrophic fire and collapsed into the watery fen edge, the kind of boggy, marshy landscape. And it's spectacularly well preserved. So I would definitely, anybody who doesn't know about this site, if you're interested in the Bronze Age, Google Must Farm, and the Cambridge Archaeological Unit, which excavated it, has fantastic dig diaries. They've got the most phenomenal textiles preserved, amazing wooden objects, you know, pots containing a wooden spoon and porridge. Anyway, it's just all amazing. But that's by the by. But anyway, from Must Farm, the fire claimed the lives of several young lambs, the complete bodies of young lambs, along with preserved sheep droppings, which is what you can see in the bottom slide there, were found in several of the houses. And the bodily remains, the remains of the lambs, were in every case from the rear left side of the buildings, as if there was a particular place in household space where maybe you had a little pen for your young animals. And of course, you know, ethnohistorically, and here's my slide of on the right, Mongolian herders. We know again from ethnographic and ethnohistoric documentation that people often take animal young into their houses in particular to look after them. Not only does that help with, you know, minding the young, but it also then encourages their mothers to come back every day, obviously, or twice a day or whatever, come and feed their young. So it's a great way of ensuring that animals are used to being handled, you know, if you want to then milk the animals for as adults, for example. Now, to talk a little bit about some of the Dutch data that my colleagues have been working on, I just want to, I suppose, what's amazing about, well, the British sites have some similar evidence as well. So you can see on the right-hand side of the slide there, these are all ditched field boundaries. So in the part of the Netherlands where we're working, and in parts of southern Britain as well, you've got these fantastic Bronze Age landscapes of field boundaries, droveways, waterholes, sorting gates, just all sorts of evidence for animal management features. So these can allow us to start to think about how people and animals are actually interacting spatially within the kind of small scale, not just a small scale setting of the individual household, but then more broadly within the landscape. So we can think about everyday practices of human-animal interaction and their importance in terms of shaping the landscape. Now, as you might just about be able to see, it's probably a bit too small up there, but the bar chart, basically, all the blue is cattle. So there's a lot of cattle. These are cattle-dominated assemblages. And the fusion data, so the fusion of the epiphyses, the ends of the long bones, gives us some estimation of aging, as does the dentition, the teeth. So the dentition, the fusion data in terms of aging tells us that you have quite a lot of younger animals and also quite a lot of older animals. So probably we're looking at quite a mixed farming economy here, where animals are being kept for both their meat and their milk. So again, that, and actually the other thing to say, of course, as you can see on the right here, is that there are also traction pathologies. So if you have cattle being used to pull plows, for example, or to pull carts, then that will often result in remodeling of the bone over long periods of time. So you can see these kinds of traction pathologies. And of course, you can think, well, if animals are being kept if cattle are being kept for their milk, then people are engaging with them every day. They're going to get to know those animals very well. If you're using cattle for traction, again, you've got to really be able to work with your animals. This is a kind of a team effort. You have to jointly direct your effort towards a particular end. You're going to be able to communicate with your animals. You're going to know the temperament of your animals and so on. So it's just really interesting thinking about all of those things. And as in Britain, there are lots of interesting deposits. So this is partially articulated skeleton of a cow, around 2 years old. And different parts of the body seem to have had different pre-depositional itineraries, for the want of a better word. So the torso, the torso is largely an articulation, but the skull and the scapula were at the tail end of the body. So the skull had been removed and placed at the tail end of the body. The skull appeared to have been decapitated, so there was a cut mark indicating that. The limbs were not in articulation with the torso, but seemed to have been removed for secondary processing. So there was a cut mark on one of them, suggesting butchery for consumption. There was dog gnawing on one of them, suggesting that, at least one member of the household that wasn't human had been involved in consuming this animal as well. One bone was burnt, and also the taphonomy, the kind of the weathering, I suppose the fracturing. There was evidence for quite varied amounts of weathering to the long bones, suggesting that they might have had kind of different pre-depositional histories before they wound up in this pit. But at some time, all of the different elements of this animal, because it was all the one animal, seem to have been reunited for deposition, which kind of indicates that they were all recognized as belonging to that animal as an individual at some level. So it's really intriguing to think about, even though this animal has been butchered and consumed, somehow the different elements of the animal are being brought back together for final deposition. So animal personhood isn't quite the right way, but animal identity or personhood or the self or whatever is being recognized in some way. But having said that, there's a strange head position where the head has been located at the tail end of the animal. And I'm nearly kind of put in mind of deviant burial. If you think about humans, this idea of deviant burial in the early Middle Ages, for example, we don't often apply ideas derived from human mortuary practice to animal burials, but it might be quite interesting if we did. Maybe this was a fractious animal that was a bit, it was a bit naughty in life, and maybe that's why it's been treated in a particular way in death. But just to put this animal in its context, so here you've got this set of really interesting kind of curvilinear enclosures, which look like some kind of big cattle corral. And you can see it's the edge of them over here. And over to one side, there are various little enclosures here, one of which has a house. You can see that's just here. And then if we go over to this side, the red splodges are waterholes. The brown splodges are hoof prints. And I hope you can just about see this, but there are hoof prints in Bronze Age Netherlands all over the place. And it's just amazing. And nobody's really studied these in detail. So we're trying to encourage excavators to try and record them in more detail, because it should be feasible to look at what animals, have made these hoof prints, and where are they? Where are the hoof prints? Are they in the droveways? This is a droveway, for example. And I love the fact that here these hoof prints are around a waterhole, and they're also kind of in the corner of this this ditched enclosure. And if you think about cattle in the landscape today, where do they congregate? They often are. They're standing around water holes, they're congregating in corners and so on. So we can see all the same kinds of things going on here in the Bronze Age. And that cow deposit that we were talking about a minute ago is this yellow splodge here. It's just been, that cow body has been deposited along the edge of this droveway. So probably what we're looking at is a series of different enclosures around this animal corral for various different types of animal handling, sorting. Probably you need to be able to sort, sheep from cattle, or males from females, or adults from young, or lactating from non-lactating animals, and so on. So you can see these potentially these little holding pens around the edge of that bigger corral might have been for those kinds of purposes. And just down here, to show you that sometimes hoof prints are in these kinds of little corner entrances. Corner entrances are very a characteristic of these little enclosures. And I guess then we can start, if we're thinking about how these field systems, if you like, relate to animal management and sorting of animals and so on, then we can start to talk about the implications of that, social implications of that for the human communities. We can think about, these are questions we can't answer really, but we can at least ask, were specific members of the community given particular tasks, the young or the old, or the male or the female, or whatever. So we can ask, who was doing these things at what time of year? Were they doing it with the whole community, or were they doing it as individual household groups, for example? So we can start to tease apart some ideas and questions around the organization of the human communities that were interacting with these animals. And then again, let me see how we're doing with time. Maybe I will, I suppose, yeah, just to say, I guess that very often, so again, we've got a lovely droveway running around here. And very often we tend to think of, I suppose, features like droveways as speaking of a human desire and ability to control animals. And maybe that's the case. But it's also worth thinking about how humans and animals might have co-created these landscapes. There is, at some level, there's certainly, animal needs and behavior are shaping human labor and relationships in these kinds of landscapes. And very often you will find that these sorts of droveways are less about humans imposing particular routes on cattle through the landscape. They're very often more about, you'll often find that these are natural routeways through the landscape that would have been taken by animals. Natural animal behavior would have likely meant that animals move through the landscape in particular ways. And they're nearly more humans formalizing and monumentalizing existing ways of animals moving through the landscape, rather than animals kind of having human will imposed on them, if you like. And I suppose we can also think about how the embodied experience and communal rhythms of daily and seasonal labor, daily and seasonal mobility, can create intersubjective memory and powerful feelings of communal identity, not only for the people, but also for the animals. This is just to show you another few hoof prints, little orange hoof prints, you can see them there. So this this droveway, it has, you know, actual hoof prints on it. There they are, which is fantastic. And then I'm going to look next at this little feature here. Again, really nice evidence for this is our droveway. The orange splodges, in this case, are hoof prints. There are hoof prints in and around this building here, which is in this yard. And there's this kind of funnel-shaped entrance stroke exit here. So we're probably looking at some kind of animal management feature here. So this isn't a house, in other words. It's not somewhere where humans are living. It might have been a milking shed or maybe a stable for housing animals in the winter, something or other. But, you know, we're able to really nicely locate these animals in the landscape. Okay, yes, I forgot to show you that slide, but that's basically what I was saying. Now, just in the last few minutes, I'll just give you a little sense of a few of the bits and pieces that were beginning to come out of our scientific analyses. So we're, as I say, we're kind of partway through with these. And my colleagues are busy working on our various samples at the moment. We're about to head off to Poland in May and collect some of the Polish samples, which will be really exciting. But predominantly my scientific colleagues have been working on the British samples so far. And again, as in the Netherlands, you can see that in southern England, you get these fantastic kind of Bronze Age landscapes here just south of Cambridgeshire. So the red lines are all ditched enclosures, settlement enclosures and associated field systems of Middle Bronze Age date. So you have a big ditched enclosure here. It's not completely clear whether this is a settlement enclosure or whether it's some kind of, again, some kind of cattle corral. And then you have some kind of a settlement up here with various fields around it and another settlement down here with various fields around it. So, you know, things that look like droveways here and here, for example. We haven't, my colleague is looking at the animal architectures, hasn't started analysing this material yet. She's just looked at the Dutch stuff, but hopefully there'll be some really nice patterns coming out of this as well. But in terms of the scientific analyses, so as I mentioned earlier, using isotopes to consider variability in diet and grazing patterns and so on, and things like birthing seasonality, weaning and so on as well. I have the spread of millet, this little slide down here, just to say that it's entirely possible that the byproducts from cultivating millet, which appears in the Bronze Age in Europe, might well have been used as cattle fodder. We don't really know yet, so that's one of the things we're hoping to look at. So some of the kind of preliminary results that we're getting indicate that there is some element of difference between some of these sites in terms of grazing strategies or what cattle are eating, which you don't need to worry about the ins and outs of this. You may not understand it, and I certainly don't. So I defer to my scientific colleagues. But effectively, one of those enclosures out of the three little areas of settlement that I showed you in the previous slide seems to have a slightly different herding strategy, because there's more evidence for either animals being grazed in forested areas or they're being fed potentially leafy fodder in the winter, whereas most of the other animals are on open grassland. So there's different strategies. And you think about if you're collecting leafy fodder for your animals in the winter to help them through the winter, that's a significant investment of time and energy. And it also suggests, you know, that kind of intimate interaction with your animals if you're actually feeding them as opposed to them being off and, you know, grazing by themselves on the grasslands. We're looking at getting some interesting results on birthing seasonality. So as I mentioned earlier, there's year-round breeding of cattle nowadays, as you'll know, but wild cattle in the distant past would have been seasonal breeders. And we know that in the Neolithic, cattle were seasonal breeders. So what's going on in the Bronze Age? And I suppose we're interested because there are all kinds of implications in terms of the organization of human labor and the way in which people interact with their animals and so on. and the investment of labour and care also involved in rearing calves. If you're trying to rear calves year round, then you might need to more intensively fodder them and so on, for example. And we are finding that in comparison with the Neolithic, because my colleagues in Paris have done a lot of work on birthing seasonality in Neolithic cattle. It seems to be very seasonal, whereas in our Bronze Age samples so far, you've got this slightly extended seasonality. So there's a longer period of the year during which cattle were fertile, potentially because they're being better fed, or maybe they're being housed indoors. So it's hard to tell whether this is a deliberate attempt on the part of Bronze Age communities to intensify production, or whether it's a byproduct of a different way of living with animals, so that animals, maybe if they're being stalled indoors, then their fertility will be better, for example. Again, with our isotope analysis, we can start to think about things like mobility. So basically mobility isotopes work on the basis that we are what we eat. So the strontium isotopes embedded in our teeth relate to the geology that we are living on over the course of our lives. So looking at cattle from our UK sites, some of them seem to have, so the individual cattle are the individual lines, coloured lines. Some of them seem to have lived all their lives on the local chalk geology, but some of them live somewhere else. So we don't know where that is just yet, but off the local chalk geology of these sites. And some of them seem to have maybe moved on and off the local chalk geology over the course of their lives. So there's interesting things there around mobility. And, we can ask, were cattle being exchanged? Was there seasonal mobility maybe going on? So there's lots of different possibilities that we need to think about. And then finally, the genetics then, just things starting to come out here. One interesting thing is that our sites, like other English sites, there is evidence for, what's the word I'm looking for? Wild introgression, that's the word I'm looking for. So aurochs, wild cattle, genetically sit over here. Domesticated cattle sit over here, but cattle from Bronze Age England are kind of spread out this way a little bit more towards the aurochs, the wild cattle, which suggests that there's some interbreeding with the wild cattle in England amongst English Bronze Age cattle populations, domesticated cattle populations, which again is interesting thinking about that in terms of, it says something about animal management. Maybe the Bronze Age cattle in Britain are let off on the range a bit more, and they're out there and they encounter the odd aurochs or whatever it might be. So again, kind of interesting things coming out there. Okay, so then I suppose just to finish up, what hopefully we're going to do eventually, you have to ask me again in another few years, is there's really interesting potential to think about osteobiographies in the sense of how human and animal biographies are interconnected. And we can think about that by bringing together all these different sources of information. And just going back to Cliff's End Farm, which I talked to you about at the beginning, there's already been mobility isotopes and ancient DNA conducted on a lot of the people from this site, including, I think, this young woman. And hopefully we will get to do the same analyses on this cow and others from the same feature, so that we can bring these kinds of data sets together, the human and the animal data sets together, to consider, I suppose, interconnections between human and animal lives and how they might have maybe traveled and encountered the landscape together, and maybe how their daily and seasonal patterns of activity might have informed and shaped one another. And I suppose it's interesting to think how, we might imagine looking at this, that this animal, this cow, was sacrificed to accompany this young woman when she died. But again, I'm very struck by the different kind of theoretical frameworks or interpretive frameworks that we apply to human and animals and the problems around that. Because in fact, yes, her skull is disarticulated. She's, represented just by the skull. And, then you've got the young woman, with her head lying on the skull. So you might think it's sacrifice. But actually, the same site has produced all sorts of different disarticulated human bodies as well. Lots of very strange things going on with human bodies at Cliffs End Farm too. So I'm just struck by how it might actually be problematic from a kind of theoretical perspective to be applying quite different interpretive frameworks or different value systems to humans and animals. Maybe they weren't thought of quite so differently in the past. But anyway, that's it really. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to ask, but thank you very much. So.
Plenty to think about. I think a lot of us probably never really gave much more of a passing thought. It wasn't just
me neither on
the dinner table.
Yeah, exactly.
But
yeah,
it just shows that.
Especially coming from an urban context, I think.
Indeed. So, has anybody got any questions they'd like to put?
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I'm struck by the what you said about mutuality, and a lot of your examples were domesticated mammals. So one can see triggers for mutuality and appreciation of mutuality between domesticated animals and human mammals and so on. What about things like chickens, for instance, and bees? Can you spot mutualities, say, in chickens?
A really good question. They come much later, of course. So you don't get them until kind of Romans and later. But there has been a lot of work. There's been Naomi Sykes in Exeter has had a whole project on chickens and other animals as well, which I think was called something like the Easter egg project, as far as I remember, something Easter related. I think she was looking at rabbits as well, possibly. But that's a really good question. I'm sure you have very similar kinds of things going on. There is evidence for the consumption of or the use of beeswax from the Neolithic. So there's certainly that goes right back. So it's really interesting to think about that. I'm sure you'd see, all these animals have, their own intelligence, their own form of intelligence and ability to recognize the world around them and interact with the world around them in a kind of knowledgeable way, So I think it's entirely possible to ask the same questions of other species, for sure.
Just to know, perspective of these animals, are there none of the examples where the craniums have been open to remove brains for tanning leather? Is there evidence of long bones being shattered for marrow? Or are these animals all sort of different reverence, or is it just
mixture?
It's a mixture, really?
Definitely, yeah. So the sites from which we've done the English sites that we've done the scientific analysis on, the majority of the animal remains from those sites would have come from kind of midden deposits, so big deposits of refuse, and they would have been very much fragmented. So yeah, so absolutely. So you do get a lot of this kind of thing where there's, articulated or semi-articulated animals that look like they're special in some kind of way, but that's definitely not to say that every animal was thought of in that way, or there's a lot of variability, I think. So it's just kind of thinking about all of it. But yeah, I'm sure they certainly did extract marrow and so on from animals. So I guess it's not, I suppose I'm not really trying to say that they didn't do that, but more that maybe the way in which they did it wasn't necessarily the kind of, they didn't necessarily just think of animals as things to eat, because they also lived with them and they knew them. yeah, I guess is my point really.
Thank you, Joanna. Excellent lecture. You mentioned leaf fodder. Can we tell there is evidence for the preferential tree species?
In terms of the tree, yeah, no, I don't know. That's a good. Not. We probably couldn't tell which tree species from. So I'm trying to remember what exactly my colleague is doing. So he's looking at in teeth. He's looking at the individual amino acids of nitrogen to distinguish leafy fodder from non-leafy fodder. But no, so we couldn't tell what type of trees, but we can tell. Now, having said that, they could be browsing in the forest. So they're either browsing in the forest or they're eating leafy fodder. So again, I think what we're trying to do is kind of triangulate multiple different sources of evidence, because as you know yourself, any single bit of evidence, archaeological evidence, you can usually interpret it 5 different ways. So if you bring lots of different types of evidence together, hopefully something will pop out.
Thanks.
That's the hope.
Can I ask just a structural question, and forgive my ignorance, but how do you know it's a droveway? What is it that
just the form. Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose a droveway, we're looking at parallel ditches. Yeah, so usually you'll have a parallel set of ditches with fields on either side, ditched fields on either side, basically.
Trackways.
Yeah, exactly. A trackway usually, because there's certain, obviously, later farming has truncated a lot of these sites. So what we're getting is the negative features. So the V-shaped or U-shaped ditches cut into the ground. So 2 of them parallel to each other, we're suggesting might have been droveways. Now, they could have been, might not have been, but certainly with the Dutch evidence, you do quite often have animal hoofprints, patches of animal hoofprints along them, which is really nice because animal hoofprints aren't very often preserved in the UK sites. So it's nice to see that, yeah, okay, there actually were animals here on these little trackways that we, were proposing, that they're using.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Again, I'm sorry for my ignorance, but how deep are these ditches? Because I've seen cows, sheep, and the ditch can be 4 foot deep, and they'll just go across it. Yeah, so certainly the argument is that probably a lot of them are hedged along one side. There's some site, in fact, one of these sites, one of the East Anglian sites, the ditches there were highly waterlogged, and the plant macrofossils were very well preserved. So it was all kind of, hedgerow kind of trees and stuff like that. So basically the suggestion is that probably they would have had ditches, or sorry, they would have had banks with hedgerows on them, because absolutely you're right, they could have hopped over these probably. So it's not like a barren landscape then, it's basically a fully sort of incorporated, like England today, almost like beautiful rows of hedges. Yeah, probably. Yeah, probably. Yeah, exactly. It's fairly, so it's a lot of the landscape has been fairly deforested at that stage. Not completely, but yeah, there would have been, exactly like you say, copses and small woodlands, and yeah, a large swathes of grazing land and so on as well, enclosed and unenclosed. So.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Great lecture, really interesting. Just talking about the animal trackways, have you actually discovered what the animals were? I mean, is it all cattle, or cattle and sheep, or cattle, sheep, goats, pigs?
Yeah, exactly. Cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, they're the primary ones. During the early part of the Bronze Age, it mostly seems to have been cattle, but then sheep seem to become more important in the later part of the Bronze Age, possibly because because early sheep, as you may know, Neolithic sheep are hairy. So the assumption is that woolly sheep come in from the Near East gradually during the Bronze Age. But interestingly enough, my geneticist colleagues haven't found any obvious genetic marker. They've been looking for an obvious genetic marker to date. When do sheep become woolly? So we're kind of assuming that from archaeological evidence, like the fact that there's woolen clothing preserved in some Danish log coffins of Bronze Age date. and there are lots of spindle whorls and loom weights, particularly from the Middle Bronze Age onwards in Britain. But actually that really well preserved site at Must Farm that I mentioned, the textiles, fabulously preserved textiles from that site, late Bronze Age site, they're all flax, they're all linen and other plant-based textiles, which is really interesting because I would have assumed they're going to be wool, but they're not. So.
I was just wondering, when you were looking at your findings, I'm thinking about the old relationship between people and dogs. And I know we had another archaeologist here about a year ago, Annie, a lady who had done some research in Roscommon and found deposits of hundreds of skulls of dogs, leading to thinking about a dog cults, for example. And so I wasn't sure if you found dogs.
Oh yeah.
And in large numbers to indicate cults, or just part of the domestic scene, or?
Yeah, I mean, again, they're like the other primary domesticates in that, they are sometimes incorporated into these kinds of special deposits. So they're definitely there. It's what I would be really interested to know is, are they herding animals? Are they guarding animals? Because, well, my random photo of the Mongolian pastoralists, so they have lots of dogs, but they don't use their dogs to help them herd their animals. They use them only for guarding, which is very interesting. Different. I'd kind of assumed that, if people had animals, if people kept cattle and sheep and they had dogs, then they would use them to herd the sheep, but apparently that's not always the case. So again, that's something that's very difficult to really work out archaeologically, but certainly interesting. There is some Bronze Age rock art in Scandinavia which seems to show a shepherd with some sheep and some dogs, suggesting that maybe there was some herding going on there. But they're definitely there.
Were there burials of humans with dogs?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. There's certainly dogs. Yeah, there are all the way through where you get, well, so burials in the Bronze Age, in the later part of the Bronze Age, are mostly cremation burials. So the evidence is a little bit more difficult to work out exactly what's going on. But in the early part of the Bronze Age, certainly in Britain, when you get more inhumation burials, you'll quite often get a person with a dog skull, or or a person in a barrow, and then the barrow ditch will have a dog skull in the ditch, or that kind of thing. So it's not necessarily and there are some complete articulated dogs as well, which I need to look at. I have a list of them. I haven't looked at them in much detail yet, but they are there for sure, and they're significant.
How does any of this relate to what Mike Parker Pearson found around Stonehenge, with the travelling of the animals all the way from Scotland down to the plains? Is there any relevance to what you're working on?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, the kinds of sites we're looking at are so far, they're quite different in the sense that they're domestic sites, they're settlements rather than big ceremonial sites. So I guess with big ceremonial sites, the assumption is if you've got lots of people coming together, they might bring animals with them for feasting or whatever. So we might not see that scale of interaction in terms of animals coming from long distances in our sites. But having said that, obviously to maintain a healthy herd, you need to, have some exchange going on, because otherwise they'll just all be interbred. So I would imagine there will be some mobility, but maybe not at that scale.
I wondered if the success of this domestication, these small groups and communities you said in Poland, implies that rustling would take place and stealing and violence.
Yeah, well, entirely possible. The interesting thing is that the evidence for violence in the Bronze Age is definitely there, but it's maybe not as widespread and endemic as we might always think. Because certainly if you look at the settlements, people's everyday landscapes, they're not really living in heavily defended fortified sites. So a lot of them are living in open settlements. I mean, there are hill forts, okay, towards the end of the period, but those might be places where people come together, assembly sites, as much as, you know, they may be as much for saying, here we are, aren't we great, look at us in the landscape, as opposed to keeping the invaders out, you know. So, and obviously in the Bronze Age, you do have this fantastic weaponry, so there's swords and things, so there is clearly some violence going on. And in fact, from this site, there's a woman in the same feature actually who has a sword blow to her skull, so she's died a violent death. So there is certainly violence, as there is in any society, but it's probably fairly low level. So exactly the kind of raiding you're suggesting, or maybe you know, yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that must have happened. It must have, given that the animals are so, you know, key to their lives. It must have happened. So you can imagine kind of, you know, small scale raiding going on between groups that sometimes resulted in violence. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Can I ask another question? Curiosity, what evidence is there for foraging animals as well at this point? Like, for hunting animals?
Oh yeah.
So, like deer, are they mixed in with it? And
they are, yeah.
Boar as well?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
I'm curious about later, like monastic sites where they have the ponds where they would keep fish and things like that. Are they anything to do with the pools, or is this not a development arrived on human farming skills?
No, not yet. No. But there's certainly, I mean, there are definitely wild animals in the mix here. So things like antler, if you look at early Bronze Age burials, there's often boar's tusks or pieces of antler, you know, worked antler objects or whatever. So they are hunting, they're still hunting. But the majority of assemblages, animal bone assemblages from this period, would be domesticated animals. So I have another colleague actually who over in England, who's got a project on wild animals in the Bronze, and in fact, wild plants and animals in the Bronze Age, because they're bound to be important. We know they were hunting, we know they're collecting stuff, you know, you get a whole range of evidence for use and consumption of wild plants as well as wild animals. But we don't really tend to think about it that much because we assume they're farming, therefore they probably didn't need to. So I think maybe it's not as appreciated as amongst archaeologists as maybe it should be. In the case of our own project, we had to kind of draw the line somewhere, so we thought we'll kind of focus on the primary domesticates, even though at some level we have to, you know, compare and contrast our cattle being treated differently to deer, for example. You know, so we'll have to look at all the animals for that reason.
I was just wondering if you have been doing analysis of people's diets, have you come across any vegetarians/vegans? Would that be possible to exist like that in the Bronze Age?
I don't, as far as I'm aware now, we haven't done anything on people, but I'm not aware of anybody who's found anything like that. I think that the studies that I know of that have been conducted on people would indicate a fairly mixed diet for this period at least. And I'm not enough of a scientist to tell you whether you could actually find to what degree you could really pin that down, I have to say.
Always imagine the diet was quite grim in those. It's not
lots of porridge. No, probably more varied than we might think, particularly, you know, if they're using a lot of wild foodstuffs, you know, fruits and nuts and so on, you know, different tubers and kind of things.
Okay. Comparison to the two regions that you're studying, the structures of the homes, the roundhouses, did they never have any animals within them at all?
Well, the must farm ones did. So yeah, exactly, the lambs, yeah. So presumably other ones did as well, but just because they tend to be kind of undifferentiated internally in terms of the space, they're kind of just simple, open, circular structures. Sometimes you do get evidence for light wattlework partitions, but we don't know what that is relating to. So yeah, if they're there at Must Farm, they're probably there elsewhere, and we're just not picking it up archaeologically, I guess.
Right. I could give you a break now, Joanna, just to say thank you very, very much indeed for coming over.
Thank you.
Really good to
Thanks
see you.
for
Thank you so
inviting me.
much.
Thank you.
Token of appreciation. Right, just before you go, there's a pair of gloves been left up in the common room. If anybody would like to claim them?
Problem solved. Excellent.
Okay, just a few announcements of forthcoming events. Next Saturday, the 5th of April, the survey group in F1 Stewart, for those members of the survey group, probably carried on the WhatsApp group. So contact any of us if you have more information. On the 9th of April, there's a general invitation for people who might be interested in going to the launch of the HED's Archaeological 2013 progress report, either in person or on Microsoft Teams at Prony. So that's 11 o'clock at Prony. There will be refreshments from 10:40. So anybody who's interested to go along, that's on the 9th of April, Wednesday, the 9th of April. The lecture the presentation starting at 11 o'clock with refreshments before. And also on the 9th of April in the evening, members are invited to the excavation. It's just started at Erina, just south of Patrick, the site of the monastic site, which was trashed by John de Courcy, before he then built in Chabby in post that. So Brian Sloan will be happy to see members there at 6 o'clock on. Then we have Easter, so wish you all a happy Easter in advance. And our next lecture is on the 28th of April in Naomi Carver. We'll be talking on archaeology of coarse earthenware, industry in Ulster during the 17th and 18th centuries. Just one more thing I'd like to mention. People were finding it quite difficult to park this evening. Just to remember that you can actually park in the main Queen's campus after 4 o'clock. The access is from University Square. The barriers will be up, so you can park there quite safely after 4 o'clock in the evening. So if you're finding it difficult next time to park around either Elm Avenue or around here, you can always walk across the road to Queen's and be quite safe there. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.